All right, welcome everyone to the Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And our topic this time is making a database web service, perhaps a little bit of a companion with our connecting to databases topic that I did a few weeks ago at the beginning of March. So start at the beginning by what is some common database design. What you typically see for people making Xojo apps is they're going to have a client app. This is the app they actually build in Xojo. And then there typically is a database server. Now, not surprisingly, this sort of thing is often called client-server app development. You have two components, the client and the server. And that sort of communication is like this. You have your client and your server, and the client talks directly to the server. In this case, it's a database, but it talks directly to it. And there can, of course, be more than one client that is talking to the database server. Now, this is a nice design. It's pretty simple. It's easy to understand, easy to work with. Like I said, it's very common. But there are some limitations with that particular design. A big one that came up when we shipped the first version of Xojo that let you build iOS apps is that you cannot create a client-server app using iOS. That just really doesn't fit that model of a mobile device. So people were obviously, befuddled. What do we do instead? Another limitation is that, generally speaking, a client-server implementation is going to want a persistent connection between the client app and the database server. Now, this may be perfectly fine. If you're building an internal app that's running on your local network, a persistent database connection is likely to not be a problem. But if you're building a different type of app, perhaps one that's spread out across something with a less reliable network connection, such as, say, the internet, requiring a persistent database connection could become a problem. It's possible that is just not going to happen. And that can make designing a typical client-server app a bit trickier because you have to have your app be able to recover from situations where the database connection is lost. There are also some potential security issues with typical client-server app. Now, again, if your app is all running locally within your own network, well, there's not as many security issues. There could be some, though. The client app essentially has to talk directly to the database. This means it needs to know how to connect to the database. There's going to need to be some sort of login of some manner. And if it's possible that people that are using your client app can figure that out, then they can connect to the database perhaps in another way. There are ways to restrict and lock that sort of stuff down, but that does become a bit of a hassle. But even worse, if your database is actually sitting out on the internet, you have to have it open in some manner so that your client app can connect to it. And that gives it kind of a target point for people to detect and hack at, essentially, and see if there's some way they can get through that. Maybe there's a weakness in a particular version of the database server you're using that can be exploited. So there's potential for some issues there. So the alternative is to use something called a web service. Now, I've talked about this in past webinars. I'm going to talk about it again today, mostly because it's a popular topic. These are being used for more and more things. There's lots of web services available in general that you can make use of in your apps. So it's good to continue to revisit this and see how you can take advantage of it. So web service is sometimes called middleware because we're putting something in the middle between essentially our database server and our client app. So you got your client, you've got the web service that is now what the client's going to want to talk to. And then you've got your database server. So here you got your client, same as before. Web service is there in the middle between the database server and the client. The client communicates to the web service. It only knows how to talk to the web service. It does not talk directly to the database server. The web service knows how to talk to the database server, And it also knows how to talk to the client. So it's sitting there in the middle and it's handling all the communication and the coordination between the two. And as there are more clients, they just continue to talk to the web service. So now your database server is kind of protected here. You cannot directly get to the database server. Only the web service can. So now the client apps don't need to know anything about the database server. Literally, they don't need to know what kind of server it is or anything. They don't need to know anything about how to connect to it. They don't need to know any of that stuff. All they need to know how to do is connect to the web service. And it does also mean that pretty much anything can be a client of your web service, as we're going to see when we look at some demos a little bit later. But your client app does not have to be an app written in Xojo. It can be accessible by any tool that knows how to talk to web services, which is pretty much everything. So how do you do this with Xojo? Well, to start, you're essentially going to use a web app as your web service. This web app is going to communicate with the database server. Now, luckily, at the beginning of the month, we talked about how to connect to databases and database servers. So that knowledge from the last webinar we did earlier this month is applicable for this particular step. You're also going to need to define the API for your web service, and that's the list of commands that your web service understands. And this is, I don't know, it's not really a science yet. There are some standards that are starting to evolve, and I'll have some links at the end of the webinar for some topics to review to give you guidelines for how you might want to define an API. And then in general, your clients are going to communicate with the web app using JSON. And that is, using HTTP over JSON. So it's going to send the JSON data to the web service. The web service is going to respond with JSON data. Now, you don't necessarily have to use JSON. I mean, it just has to be data. I've seen lots of web servers also use XML, but really JSON is probably what you're going to want to stick with. It's more compact, so it's smaller, should be a little faster. I find that it's a lot easier to read if you want to view the JSON in something else, a text file or tools for it. It doesn't have as much stuff all over the data like XML does. And of course, in the case of Xojo, JSON is supported on all the platforms. iOS does not have built-in XML support. So if you wanted your web service to be easily usable in a Xojo iOS app, going with JSON makes a lot more sense. And then in the Xojo web app, there's two event handlers that you can use to process the web service API calls, and that's either handle special URL or handle URL. They don't really work differently. They just control the type of URL path that you're allowed to send in to the web app. And then, of course, you're also going to need to use an HTTP socket. And you can use the new one that's in the Xojo framework, xojo.net.http socket, or the older one. And I've done webinars on the new one probably last summer, but the big difference between these two is that xojo.net.http socket uses HTTP 1.1, and the other one uses HTTP 1.0. So obviously, if you have your druthers, you probably want to use the newer one. So that's a high level of how you would do this using Xojo, the overall steps that need to be done. And now, what are some specific options? Well, obviously, you could do it yourself. And I think I clicked something I shouldn't have, so let's go back here. All right, so you can do it yourself, or you can use a framework. And an example of a framework, which we're going to be looking at shortly, is Luna, which is an open source project created by Tim Dietrich. And I believe he's sitting here in our viewer list for this webinar, and maybe he'll answer a question or two if I'm stumped later on. But It's a pretty cool thing, and we'll be looking at that a little bit later. And of course, you can do it yourself, which means you essentially are building your own thing and doing it however you want. For testing a web service, it's great to have some sort of REST client that allows you to call the APIs of your web service, see the results that come back without having to write code. Because you're going to want to test things pretty easily, and having to write a bunch of Xojo code and run your app and then use the debugger can be a little more hassle than just running a little client that just shows you kind of the raw data coming back and forth and allows you to easily check things out. I'm going to be using here a client called PAW, P-A-W. I've been using that for quite a while now, 6 months or more, and it's pretty slick, as you'll see. And one good thing about PAW is that one of our engineers, Greg, wrote a little blog post, because PAW is very extensible, and he wrote a couple extensions that you can add to PAW so that it can essentially generate Xojo code for you that you can just take from PAW and paste into your apps. And we'll see what that looks like when we're using PAW. So we're going to start with a simple example. This is going to be the do-it-yourself model, so it's intentionally kept a little bit simple. And what it's going to do is it's going to get some data from the Eddie's Electronics SQLite database. This is a database that's included in the Xojo examples folder. It's used by a few different apps in there, and particularly the Eddie's Electronics sample app. But it's a good source of some built-in data that we can kind of just pull from and display. And this web service is available online if you want to play with it. And you can go to this part of the documentation for a page essentially that describes the very tiny API associated with it. This web service is hosted on Xojo Cloud, and you can call it and get back some data. We'll run it here locally and access the one that's on Xojo Cloud as well. So let's take a look at a demo of this. All right, here is the Eddie's Electronics Xojo project. That's the web project. And you can see I've expanded everything here. There's not really a lot of code in this at the moment because this is simple and it's only accessing a few small parts of the database, essentially just getting data from the database. But it has the core components you need to start creating your own web service, essentially. So the two big things you can see here is on the open event handler, there's code to connect to the SQLite database, very similar to what was discussed in the last webinar. Nothing new or clever there. And then here I'm using the handle special URL event handler. And it is just checking for essentially two different API method calls, get all customers and get a single customer. And those are just calling methods that go to the database and grab the particular data that's relevant for that method call. And it just uses standard processing to go through and get the data from the database, but it's packaging it all up so that it can, putting it in a dictionary essentially, or actually this is using a JSON item, and then just returning it as JSON. And if you go back here, you can see that once it gets the results, it sets the status code to 200, meaning that everything's hunky-dory, okay, and it sends it back to the client that called it. So the client that called is going to get back a blob of JSON that is something your app can then use. So let's see what this looks like. I'm going to run this here. All right, so I just have the web app to come up automatically with the doc page that shows the Eddie's Electronics web service. But the app itself, the page, is irrelevant when you're doing a web service because you're using that handle URL method or handle special URL method, and that doesn't interact with the browser specifically. But you need to start the web app. So now that it's running, I can fire up PAW here. So this is the paw tool. And you can see here that it's going to allow me to test my web service without me specifically having to write any Xojo code to do the testing. So I can just have my web service running, and I can use paw to call the web service and see what I get back for results. So to call web services stuff, you use a URL, of course, and this one is the URL for the app I just clicked run on, so it's running locally. So this is standard URL. I changed the port a little bit so I can have multiple things running at once here. Because I'm using the special URL event handler, all my calls have to use this /API part of the URL. And then I include essentially the API method name that I want. And I can refresh so that it calls the web service and returns the data. And here you can see the data was returned. It was returned as a bunch of JSON. All kinds of JSON data. But you can see it has the names and all that stuff. You can click around on this thing to see what it looks like. You can change it to a JSON view so you can view it a little more cleanly. All kinds of cool stuff. Expand and look at things. So this is a handy way to make sure that your web service is returning the data you expect without having to write a whole nother app to do it. And like I mentioned, this is the paw tool. I'm going to bring up the help menu on it so you can see it here. And Lucky Marmot, I guess, is the company that makes it. Again, a pretty slick tool. I did do another tool called Resty that I made with Xojo a little while ago that did about 1/1000th of what this can do. But it did allow you to make API calls and get some data back and stuff like that. But a tool like this is a lot more sophisticated and certainly worth getting if you spend a lot of time working with web services. And I'm sure there's plenty of other related type tools. Now, as you're looking at this tool, you can see down here in this bottom window, there's a section that's showing what looks like Xojo code. And this is the extension that's been added to paw. And you can see I can click the little thing here, and you can see there's a bunch that are also available online for other languages. But I added the two extensions that Greg had written, Xojo New Framework and Xojo Old Framework, that will essentially throw together some Xojo code based on what your call looks like. So you can see here, this is a very simple one, but it is creating a socket and plugs in the URL for you and then puts the line of code you need. So this is handy. It'll get a little more handy when we look at some of the other ones that have a bit more setup to do than this one. But you can see that's what it looks like. And also for testing purposes, you can see here, this is the same web service that's running on Xojo Cloud. And you can see it returns the same data because it's the same app as it should. But that's something you can play with on your own as well if you want to, have a web service to just monkey around with and see how some stuff comes back. Now this, like I mentioned, is a very simple example. It doesn't really have a standard API in particular. I just had a couple methods that I happened to call names that I thought made sense, but it's not a lot of stuff in here. It's a very, very beginnings of how you might create a web service. But now we're going to take a look at Luna. And this is a bit nicer. So what is Luna? Well, from the GitHub page, it's an open source framework for creating RESTful APIs. And this is made by Tim Dietrich. There's a link to his page where he introduces Luna. And certainly this is an impressive open source project, and you're going to see how it's going to help save you time if you need to create web services that talk to databases. And it has built-in support for a lot of things. You don't have to write all this code from scratch. You can start with the Luna project and just start adding your own things to it. And the cool thing is it has the ability to give you some sort of standard design for your API right out of the gate, so you don't have to learn about all this stuff necessarily from scratch, although that is always a good idea. So it has built-in support for a bunch of HTTP request methods. There's get and post and put and patch and delete. Some of those you may have not heard of before. Get's a pretty common one. That one is used to actually get or return data. Post is for adding new data. So like adding, doing like an insert to a table, I suppose, how you would equate that. Put and patch are very similar. They're both for updating data, but in my reading, it seems like patch is a newer method that is being used to allow you to send in just the pieces of the data you're changing, whereas put, even though it's updating data, wants you to send in all the data. And if you don't include something, the results aren't quite as clear, but it either like removes that part of the data or maybe returns an error code or something like that, depending on how you implement it. It seems like a lot of web service APIs are kind of having put and patch be used interchangeably, but Luna allows you to separate them, which is nice. And then the delete method does what you would expect. It allows you to send a request to delete something from the database. Now, specifically, you don't really need to use these separate methods to do these things. These are just methods that get essentially notified, or they're the different methods you can identify. You could certainly just do a get and have special tags in to do all these things. And some older web services APIs that maybe you've used do that sort of thing. I think some of these methods are still in the, quote, proposal stage and maybe aren't officially approved, but they are starting to get used a lot more. Luna itself does a great job of handling HTTP response status codes, which is something when I've tried to build web services myself, I've tended to gloss over and will sometimes ignore. So this means that you get, if the data came back okay, it'll return a 200. If there was an error of some kind, it'll return the appropriate status code that's related to the error. So that's kind of all in there for you, which is nice. Luna also has the ability to support versioning, which is essentially, two different API methods, but they're versioned separately. So maybe they accept different input data or return different output data, and you can keep them both running at the same time. It has some support for authentication, very useful, something I ignored in my simple example. And by default, it supports MySQL, but you can very easily tweak Luna to connect to other databases. In fact, the example we're going to look at here is actually connecting to Postgres with only just a few lines of code to change. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at an example that gets data from the Eddy's Electronics Postgres SQL database. This is a database I also used at the beginning of the month in the Connecting to Databases webinar. So let's take a look at this. All right, we can stop that one. Let's switch to our Luna. And I'm just going to run this first. So it has a default page that comes up. Again, it's not really needed for anything. So if I go back to PAW, all right, I sent here a request to my locally running Luna web service. So you can see it used the local web address here. It has the version embedded right in the URL, and then it's calling the customer method. This is sending in a header that contains some values for authentication. And it's returning JSON here. And in this particular case, it's an array of 10 customers that are in the Postgres database. That's actually all I loaded into the Postgres database was 10 of the customers in the Eddy's Electronics full data set. And you can see what that looks like here in raw form. And you can tell that's an array just because it's got that bracket that's right there. So you can see initial test of Luna worked. It returned data. And that's often the first thing you want to test when you're doing this, is to make sure you actually get data back. When you're doing these testing, as you're editing your web service, a common thing you're going to run into is that you're going to forget to restart your web service after you've made some code. So then you're going to go to run this, and it's going to return back something that says not found or cannot connect to server or something like that. And you're going to be like, oops, forgot to start my web service. Little things like that. You can see down here in the Xojo extension thing, it's got some more code here to show you what you could use to connect, showing you how to set the request header and do the connection. Now let's take a look at what that code actually looks like. So here is the Luna project, and which you can grab on GitHub. I showed the URL earlier. I'll have links to all these things available on the Dev Center. Actually, it's already up, but I'll make sure you all are aware of where you can get to that stuff. Now, when you grab the Luna project from GitHub, it comes pre-populated with a bunch of things already, because it's set up to essentially connect to a MySQL database, and it has some sample methods that are just a great starting point. You can often just take these sample methods, duplicate them, and edit them for your own purposes, which is kind of what I did here. Now, the sample ones are all the ones that start with contacts. And what I did is I created a couple customer ones to connect to the customer's database that's in the Eddie's Electronics PostgreSQL database. Now, in most cases, you don't need to change any code that's anywhere other than in these little API method definitions. The handle URL is all set up to parse all this stuff out, and you don't really have to worry about it. It's handling the status codes, routing stuff off appropriately, and you don't need to worry about it. All you need to do is come here and define your stuff. So if we look at get, this is the one we called. This is our customer's get, and you can see how it's versioned here by its name. And again, looking at the code here, you can see that it's pretty straightforward. Really, the only thing that you needed to tweak was the SQL statement to tell it, where you're getting the data from. So if I look at the original one that was included in the Luna download, you can see it was just grabbing data from the context data that it's set up with. So I just had to tweak these SQL statements to work with my particular Postgres database. And my table is called customers. And when I want a specific record, rather than looking it up by email address, I'm looking it up by ID. So I have that specified here. And of course, Postgres specifies the parameters using $sign and a number rather than just a question mark like MySQL does. So you have to change that. But the rest, I didn't have to add any other code anywhere else, because this is calling into the Luna framework, which is down here in this Luna module. And it's able to hit the database, get the data, package it up as JSON for you, and return it all back. So I didn't have to write any of that boilerplate code, essentially. The related method here, the other one that I implemented, is patch. And this allows me to update something on that customer table. Now let's look at what that looks like in PAW. So you can see here, and I didn't mention authentication or authorization, but we'll look at that in a moment. URL here, it's a patch call, so it says patch up here, still calling the customer's method, and it's supplying a specific customer ID. In the body, I can specify JSON of the values that I want to update. So here I could change this to say I want to change the city. That sends the request off, and it returns back the changed data. So you can see here the city has now changed. And if I went back to my original call, and if I found the right ID, of course, it's this one. Nope. Why am I not seeing the right one? Well, let's do this call then instead, since it probably isn't in the order I expected. So here I'm just requesting the specific ID, so I don't have to go through the whole array to find it, which obviously is faster. I should have just done that in the first place. But you can see it pulled back Juneau here rather than the original city name of Anchorage. So it made the change. And this, again, this is code that I did have to write. This is a little bit longer. But I mean, this is database code that I probably would have to write in some form anyway, no matter what type of app I was building. And you can see here, it just, hitting up the database to get the specific row that needs to be changed. Checking all the possible inputs in the JSON. And if any aren't found, then it sets them to what's already in the database so that the value doesn't get lost. And then I've specified the update statement that will make the change. And then essentially called the bind method to map these values back so that the prepared statement can run. Again, a lot of this is boilerplate. I just took what was here in the original thing, I duplicated it and tweaked it. One nice thing about Postgres over MySQL is you don't have to specify all the types. So that was allowing me to delete quite a bit of code. But otherwise, pretty much the same. And if you're doing a lot of these, there's probably some of this code that you could even make reusable so that you weren't exactly doing 100% copying and pasting if you needed, a bunch of different tables that needed to have a patch method set up for them. There's probably some of your own methods you could write that would, contain reusable code. So that is what this looks like. Now, I just want to bring up here the authenticate method. When we looked at the paw call, you saw here that it has an authorization, and then there's a value in here. I guess I can't make that bigger. So this here is a value that is essentially going to allow you to call the API. So if I were to change this to something else, so now it's telling me I'm not authorized to call my particular API because my authorization value that I sent in is not one that my web service knows to accept. So it's just going to reject me. That's kind of built in right there, which is nice. Now, what you use to do the authorization is entirely up to you. I'll talk about that a bit more. Right now, I only have specific code in here. I just generated a GUID, and I'm essentially using that. And if you don't supply this exact GUID, then you cannot connect to this web service. There are lots of ways you can implement authorization on your web services, but this has a built-in method that it kind of gives you one place to put all that so you can easily handle it. All right. I'm going to make sure we cover these last things. So last thing to look at here is, well, how do you call this stuff, get this data into to use in a Xojo app? We looked at it using paw, which showed us the raw JSON that was coming back, which was great. And now we can try it in a couple Xojo apps here to see what that looks like. So all of these apps are just going to call the customer thing to get back all the customers that are in there and then display them very quickly in a list box. Nothing too fancy. But you can see this is a desktop app, pulled that back there. And iOS app is going to do the same thing. And you can even have another web app calling a web service to get the data. So they all pull the data back. And what does that code look like? Well, it looks very similar in all of them. So you can see here, this is the code that kicks off the call. This was just cut and pasted from PAW using that little code that shows at the bottom. And then I tweaked it a little bit. So rather than creating the socket in code, I actually have added a socket to my window layout. And then on the socket, the common piece of code you'll see in all of them is the page received event handler, which essentially is going to take that JSON that came back from the web service as raw data, essentially, and convert it back to actual JSON, and then loop through it and add it to the list box. So that's what the desktop code looks like. And if we go to iOS, I think you're going to see it looks nearly exactly the same. So as you can see here, other than the fact that we're adding it to a table rather than the list box in iOS app, the parsing of the JSON and all that is exactly the same. The web one is a little bit different because this is not using the new HTTP socket. It is using the classic HTTP socket. And this is because of a bug in the new HTTP socket where it doesn't actually work in web apps yet. But that is going to be fixed very, very soon. And then you would have the exact same code available in all three of the apps for getting the data back. Here it's pretty similar, but not quite exactly the same. All right, let's find this, go back here. All right, before I chug along here, I'm just going to check my little question window. All right, I think I answered Edwin's questions. Let's mark those. All right, Carol is asking, assuming you have a multi-user database, do you need to worry that someone else may have updated the row after you fetched it, but before you did your update? And yeah, depending on your database, you absolutely could have to worry about that, same as you would with any multi-user database. And how you would solve that depends on how you want to solve that sort of thing. You know, timestamps and other things might be something you want to use to track if a row's been modified underneath you, so to speak. But yeah, that's the sort of standard multi-user database stuff. Web services aren't going to really shield you from having to deal with that. All right, so I talked a little bit about authentication, and the method, the reason it's there is so that you can ensure that only approved clients are talking to your web service. And the Eddie's Electronics web service that I made has no authentication whatsoever. Anyone can connect to it, and they'll get back a list of those customers. Luckily, that data is all fake, so no harm done. But generally, you know, if your web service is available for the public to use, that's probably not the world's greatest idea. So in general, you're going to want to have some way to authenticate to ensure that the client that wants to talk to your web service is approved. Now, a common way that I've seen, and I think which Luna also works well with, is to use something like an API key. And essentially the way this works is that you set up a place, or you do this manually, but anyone that wants to talk to your web service has to request from you an API key. And this can literally be anything. GUIDs are probably great for this. But you just generate a key and you provide the key to the person. Now, when they register, you know, they'll probably, you know, fill out a form, has their email address or something like that. And then you return back to them an API key. And then after you've generated this key, you save it somewhere, probably in your own database. And then in your web service, when someone tries to connect, they provide this API key. You get the API key, you look it up in your database to see if it's a valid one that you've previously registered. And if it is, you let the web service continue along its merry way. But if it's not authorized, you return back that method we saw before that says not authorized. And the benefit of this particular design is that you can revoke it. So if for some reason and you can track these things too. So if it turns out, you are selling access to your web service, you can use this API key to track who's connecting to it, how much data is being sent, how much data is being accessed, that sort of thing. If people are hitting it up too much, you can revoke the API key. You could restrict the API key. You can do all kinds of your own rules about its usage based on your needs. If it turns out the API key gets stolen in some manner and it's being used by a lot of different apps that shouldn't be using it, you can just go into your database, set a flag that says no longer valid, and your authorization code, when it checks the API key, can say, hey, this one is no longer good, and return the unauthorized message. So it has quite a bit of flexibility there. And like I said, it seems to integrate well with Luna. But there are other ways. You could certainly use a VPN depending on what your needs are for the web service. This is probably more useful for a specific web service that is not public in any way, but they're very secure. These other two methods I'm not specifically familiar with yet. I haven't done much research on them other than identifying them, but there's something called a token and SSL method and OAuth, which I'm sure everyone's heard of. I haven't worked enough with OAuth yet to have any practical examples of these two things. That's looking into OAuth is on my list. Might make a good webinar in the future. But if you're looking at web services in general to use in your apps on the internet, the two techniques that I've seen most often used by web services are either the API key method or OAuth. All right, a few closing things, and then we can take any questions people have. So I want to point out that XDC is later this year in October, 5th to the 7th in Houston, Texas. And the session list is now available. You can head over to the XDC site to see the sessions. I think there's right around 30-ish that are listed there right now. And there are some web services sessions, including a Luna session by its creator, Tim Dietrich, which you're certainly going to want to attend if you're interested at all in Luna. He'll be able to go into it in much greater detail and probably give you some more case studies on how he's actually used it for other things. And of course, you'll get to sit with him at the dinner events and chat with him and all that other fun stuff. So there's at least 2 web services specific sessions at XDC. And I suspect several other sessions are probably going to touch on or talk about web services in some manner just because of how relevant they are these days. Registration is open. It's been open for a little while now. Dana wanted me to absolutely remind people, or I should say tell people, that it is 50% full as of yesterday, which is way ahead of our normal. I don't know what the phrasing would be for that, but we're ahead of schedule on that. We're not usually at 50% full this far in advance of the conference. So it's possible it could sell out. So if you have any interest in this at all, check out the web page. Contact us if you have specific questions. Contact me, and then sign up. There's not an unlimited size to the conference. These things are restricted by a lot of reasons and have a maximum upper limit. And again, that's the URL, which has all the information there: session list, presentation bios, that sort of stuff. And I love this quote from an XDC attendee, that attending XDC was a fire hose of knowledge. And certainly if you get anything at all out of these webinars are just a tiny fraction of the sort of things you get at XDC, because they allow just much better interaction. And of course, because it's once a year, the presenters have worked on their sessions for months and months and months, and have honed them to a T, uh, which you can get some deep knowledge. And of course, you don't always get stuck with just the same person talking to you over and over. You get a wide variety of people that you can then talk with after the session. So, great place to get Xojo information. Now, this is just a bunch of links of places to go if you want to learn more about designing your REST API, essentially. And all of these links are already listed in Dev Center, and I'll switch over there in a second to show you where you can get all that. I haven't actually read through all of these yet. I've scanned them. I think one of these was recommended by Tim Dietrich, and a few others I found in my searching and research for this stuff, but all covered some good things. And none of this, of course, is going to be Xojo specific. These are about designing your API and different techniques you can do it, and why one might make more sense in some situations and others might make sense in other situations. The usual sort of design related things. All right, so that isn't the page I wanted. So let's go back here. All right, so if you go to the Dev Center, this is the page for this webinar. And when the recording is available, it will also show up here. A little circular reference where the recording is going to reference a page that's going to have the recording. Freaky. But I already put the links up here. So you can just come here and click links to a variety of things in case you didn't jot those down. And then I'll also update this where there'll be a link to the actual slides and the projects I showed here. So you'll be able to download and grab that. And that should all be available probably later today. Or if not today, tomorrow. All right. Now we've reached the question area here. And let me just see here. I think I answered that one. Covered that one. I got a question here in French. And my French is like 10 words, but I think this person is asking if we could please do webinars in French. And I think that won't be done by me because, like I said, I know about 10 words in French. But I will check with our French fellow to see if that's a possibility. Oh, and excellent. I was just going to do a call for Tim to see if he had any other tips to offer up. And right here, sitting in my queue, is a comment from Tim. And Tim Dietrich, the creator of the Luna project, wants to note that one of the benefits about using an API is that you can easily swap out the back end without having to update the client. And I think I touched on this briefly, but as he notes, you can change your database, and as he says, no one will ever know. So right now, my Eddie's Electronics example that's using Luna is connecting to Postgres SQL. And I could switch all that out to be MySQL or just connect it to the SQLite database. And the clients that are communicating with Luna won't know, won't care, don't need to be changed. The web service is what needed to be changed, but the clients that communicated with it don't care. And so that is an excellent feature. It kind of gives you a little bit of layer there between your implementation of the database and how you communicate with it. Very useful thing. Cato's asking for more on authorization. I kind of gave the overview of what I know about authorization. Again, the API key method is the one I'm most familiar with. Authorization is nothing that's Xojo specific in any way, shape, or form. So that's sort of a generic topic that I'm sure Google can give you lots of different suggestions for different ways you can authorize your web APIs. But like I said, in my research, API key method and OAuth were the two most common, and I think API key is probably the easiest to implement. And seems to work very well with Luna itself. And let's No, I don't want that or that. I wanted to bring up the Luna page, so let me get that URL here. So this is the Luna page in GitHub where you can download the project and play around with it. I took this and very briefly tweaked it to allow it to support Postgres from the built-in MySQL support. I'm sure I'll be talking to Tim at some point soon about possible changes we can make to this to make it a little bit more generic for communicating with any database. But even now, the changes to connect to Postgres were minor and will be minor for any database, really. Let's see, Lance here is asking about the PA extensions. So let's see if I can bring that up here. So if you go to the Xojo blog, you can read Greg's article on this, and at the bottom there are download links for the two PA extensions. And then to set these up, you just have to unzip them and copy the folders into the extensions folder for PA. It's really pretty easy. And then once you do that, they become available as an option right here. Highly recommended. They make working with this tool very slick and easy. And it's nice to have it pre-fill a bunch of code in for you, so you don't have to write this code over and over. Some of this code can get a little repetitious once you've done it a few times, and that's kind of the purpose of frameworks, to make it easier for you so you don't have to write the same code over and over. All right, I don't have any more questions in the forum. Certainly, if you have more questions about REST in general, you're always welcome to email me, paul@xojo.com, of course. The Xojo forum is a great place to chat about this or any other Xojo topic. So if you are implementing something in REST and want advice of your peers, ask away there. And of course, like I mentioned, XDC is going to be a great source of web service information with 2 sessions by some people that have built some serious stuff using web services and be able to give you a lot of actual practical advice that you can take advantage of. All right, I think that wraps it up for today. Be sure to check the Dev Center later today, early tomorrow, for a recording of this and all the download links. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.